Order. Dr. Julian Lewis to move the motion.
Thank you very much, Sir David, and it's a pleasure to be able to introduce this important subject of investigations into fatalities in Northern Ireland involving British military personnel under your chairmanship. Now, I must say that my interest in this topic was first sparked by contributions made at an end-of-term debate by my honourable and gallant friend for Beckenham and my honourable and gallant friend for Filton and Bradley Stoke, both of whom are with us today, although one of them, sadly, as a PPS, cannot contribute personally to the debate. And the Defence Select Committee agreed to look into this question, and we delved into it very much from a point of view of what was technically possible and what was impossible to do for reasons of international law. And when we look back at the period of the Troubles, and we are solely concerned with that period from the beginning of the Troubles in 1969 to the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, there were 3,260 Troubles-related deaths. Of those, 238 were the result of engagements by military personnel. So we have over 3,000 deaths, we have over 200 involving military personnel. And what was exercising the concern of the committee particularly in the context of what had happened with soldiers being brought to court as a result of the much more recent campaign in Iraq, where thousands of potential cases appeared to be having to be investigated, and yet at the end of long and tortuous and expensive processes were finding to be without much or indeed any substance in the vast majority of cases, was a concern that a similar sort of process was now going to begin retrospectively in relation to those 238 military deaths that had occurred during the period of the Troubles. And in the course of the inquiry that we held, we took the advice of a panel of 4 distinguished lawyers who gave us evidence. And I drew a number of lessons from what they had to say. What they were telling us was this: it is possible, if it is decided, to draw a line under the events of such a long period in the past and so long ago, it is possible to do this. But what they assured us was not possible under international law was to do it in a selective fashion. They were quite clear that there are 2 conditions that have to be met if we wish to bring in, as the committee felt we should bring in, a statute of limitation concerned with Troubles-related deaths up to the date of the Belfast Agreement. And the 2 conditions were the one that I've already alluded to, which is the need that it must apply to everybody, and the second condition, which is a requirement under international law, which is that there must be a proper investigative process of deaths which have occurred, even though that may not lead, and indeed if there is a statute of limitations, that definitely would not lead to a prosecution. Now, I started to discuss this with various interested parties. The Democratic Unionists with whom I discussed this certainly want there to be a statute of limitation applying to the military forces, the police, and the security agencies. But they have grave difficulty with applying such a statute to former Republican paramilitaries. Only yesterday, and for the first time, and I welcome it, I was given the opportunity to have a discussion with the 3 of the Sinn Féin elected MPs to this Parliament. And they were interested, I think it's true to say, in something that already seems to apply to Republican paramilitaries, but they were not interested in something that would apply to the military, the police, or the security agencies. And there is a certain lack of clarity, to put it mildly, about what the present policy is. Because, and we discovered this in our discussions yesterday, there was a genuine failure to agree, even on the facts, as to whether the limitations that already exist on the sentencing that can be applied to convicted paramilitaries apply to service personnel as well. What are those existing restrictions? Well, I think we know what they are. As part of the agreements that have been reached after so many years, so many negotiations, so much death, so much tragedy, and so much trouble, it was agreed that no matter how great the offence, no matter how many the victims, no matter if you had killed dozens, scores, or even just a few individuals, if you were convicted under the terms of the agreement, and if you were a paramilitary, you could not be sentenced to more than 2 years in prison. So the likelihood is you would not serve more than 1 year in prison. But there seemed to be no agreement, and I don't know if the Minister will be able to enlighten us today. If not, I hope he'll write to us definitively, as to whether this restriction applies to the military. The Sinn Féin MPs definitely thought that it applied to the military. And yet, I had it previously explicitly put to me by a lawyer for one of the service personnel currently facing trial that this 2-year maximum limit, no matter how heinous the offence, to which a Republican or presumably any other paramilitary can be sentenced, did not apply to the military. If it does not apply to the military, I think it's a fairly safe bet that this total imbalance between unlimited sentences that could be imposed on soldiers, as opposed to a 2-year sentence and 1 year of that served in jail, which can be imposed on paramilitaries, is something that is so egregious that it is hard to imagine that, at the very least, the government would not seek to impose a cap for all who may be affected by any proceedings. But I want to try and take a wider view with this, and I want to appeal to all the people who are involved in one way or another in the tragedy that was the Troubles of Northern Ireland, to try and take the broader view. Now, it's been put to me in very stark terms that people who suffered losses during that period, even if it was only 40 years ago, cannot rest until these matters are resolved. And I share their understanding of this, because in my own case, I can perceive something of what they feel, because in my own case, my family was caught up in the Holocaust, and all that part of it that was still in Poland in the Second World War was annihilated, with the exception of one very small family unit that was saved by courageous non-Jewish Poles. And I know that I felt for years after the war, even though this happened a few years before I was born, I felt for years after the war that the people who did this should be hounded forever. But that is not the situation that we face today, because we have already decided that in the interest of an overall settlement, there should be a limit on the maximum sentence that can be faced by paramilitaries of no more than 2 years. And so by no stretch of the imagination can the punishment be said to fit the crime. Now, I want to come now to the second element of what the distinguished professors told our committee when they were advising us about what would be possible and what would not, as far as international law was concerned. And that was, they said, that as well as any statute of limitation having to apply to everybody, because if you apply it only to the forces of the state, then you are legislating for state impunity, and that is illegal under international law. They said as well as that, it must be coupled with a truth recovery process. And I think we all know where we first began to hear about truth recovery processes. We began to hear about it in relation to what happened in South Africa after Nelson Mandela came out of prison and after the changes that occurred, and the decision that was taken in South Africa to draw a final line under all the horrors from whichever side, from whatever part, from whether it was state authorities, whether it was revolutionaries, whether it was innocent civilians who had been caught up in someone else's crossfire. They decided that it was in the interests of the peace and coherence and the possibility of building some form of united community after the event. They decided that a line must be drawn, but that families must have closure and they must have the best possible opportunity to find out the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. And that was how you had a situation when people came forward who had been involved in terrible activities, who gave testimony, secure in the knowledge that even if they were incriminating themselves, they would not be prosecuted, and how there was some form of resolution for those people who had been bereaved in the sense of public accountability and discovery of the truth. Not only was it a brilliant and magnanimous concept, it was also, as we know, a legal requirement. There is a legal requirement to investigate. There is not a legal requirement to prosecute. Now, the trouble we have in a situation in Northern Ireland, and I hope I will not strike the wrong note by seeming to be flippant at this point, goes back, of course, to the origins of the Troubles in 1969. And I went to university the following year, 1970, and while I was at university in Oxford, I made a friend called Martin Seif. You might just deduce from his surname that he has the same sort of background as I do. And I remember him trying to explain to me the depth of division between the communities in Northern Ireland. And he said, for example, he said, there was one occasion when I found myself cornered by a gang in the street. And they asked me that age-old question, are you a Protestant or are you a Catholic? To which Martin thought he had the perfect, truthful answer. He said, I'm a Jew. Yes, they said, but are you a Protestant Jew or a Catholic Jew? Now, I am not trying to be flippant about this. I am trying to indicate that there are irreconcilable and deep-seated beliefs at work here. In the role of the Defence Select Committee, our concern has to be for the welfare of the service personnel, and we do not wish to see circumstances where hundreds of old cases are reopened, even in the absence of any new evidence, which means that they are highly unlikely to be successfully brought to a conclusion if you regard it as being successful in terms of getting a conviction. But nevertheless, people are put through a tremendous ordeal at a late stage of their lives, and at the end of it all, in the vast majority of cases, it will almost certainly be found that they did nothing more than their duty and they didn't commit any offence at all. So our concern as the Defence Select Committee had to be, in our report, to make a recommendation about what should happen to these personnel. And we were unanimous in believing that a statute of limitations making any Troubles-related offences or alleged offences up to the date of the Good Friday Agreement should be enacted. We felt it is for the government of the day to go wider and decide what other groups besides service personnel and associated police and agencies ought to be included in that. But we did not shy away from pointing out that the unanimous expert legal advice we received from the 4 professors made it quite clear that if a statute of limitations was going to be introduced for anyone, it had to be introduced for everyone. And this is what is going to be very difficult for the different parties on that terrible divide in Northern Ireland, which we are seeking to repair, to accept. The unionists take a view that some people should benefit from the statute of limitations, but not others. The Republicans take a view that others should benefit from a statute of limitations, but not the people that the unionists want to see benefiting from a statute of limitations. I am going to go as far as I can without breaking any personal confidences, and it may be that I'm misinterpreting the signals. But from my conversations with people on either side of this argument, I sometimes get the impression that they are held captive by the response they feel they have to make to the people who elected them and brought them to this House. But I sometimes detect, perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps I'm misreading the signals, I sometimes detect that in their heart of hearts, they know that there is either going to be a solution for this issue which applies to everyone, or there is going to be no real solution that applies to anyone, but they will never be able to articulate it or to promote it. And I believe that it is a step forward that the government has said that it is going to hold a consultation, and that in that consultation the possibility of a statute of limitations will be one of the options aired. And I also believe that sometimes you must seize the opportunity to take a lead. And there is nothing of a legal nature to prevent this Parliament from enacting a statute of limitations, because if it applies to everyone, if it is coupled with a truth recovery process, it will maximize the chance of people finding out what happened to their loved ones, and it will maximize the chance of avoiding the poisoning of the settlement so far reached by a constant succession of cases being brought before the criminal courts. But there is another factor on which I wish to end, and which I hope the Minister will take back to his colleagues in the Northern Ireland office. And I was particularly impressed by it with the in the meeting that I had yesterday with 2 other colleagues, 2 Labour colleagues, in fact, and I met the Sinn Féin MPs. And from their point of view, it seemed to me, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting what they said, it seemed to me that one particular ongoing issue was the failure to hold inquests into the deaths of many of the people who died during the Troubles. And I just wonder if we could set to one side this route of trying to get to the truth by having a succession of old men with insufficient evidence against them nevertheless being dragged through the courts, if as part of an overall settlement we could all decide to go ahead with a statute of limitations applying to everybody, that might then open up the possibility of inquests being held So a combination of inquests being held into the deaths that have so far not had inquests, and a truth recovery process when people know they can come forward and say what happened without any danger of incriminating themselves, that might not be the basis for a step forward. So David, in concluding, I would just say this. Today's debate is just one piece in an enormous jigsaw that people have been trying to put together in order to come to a conclusion that could enable the communities in Northern Ireland to live at peace with each other, and, as far as we're concerned, to ensure that soldiers who did their duty are not hauled through the court years after the event when no new evidence is available. And I do hope that people don't have too great an expectation that the production of an individual report or the holding of an individual debate will do anything other than add to the momentum. But one thing I think the Defence Committee can claim is that we have focused attention on one specific remedy that does offer a way forward. If it was a way forward with no disadvantages, then of course people would have signed up to it or something similar long ago. There are disadvantages to every policy you could do, and people are going to have to make sacrifices. And people do make sacrifices, and people have made sacrifices. And the question is it better to go down the route of endless court hearings and deepening divisions and poisoning of the links that have been slowly and gradually been building up of a more positive nature, or is it better to take a leaf out of the South African book? And I conclude just with this thought. After all that he went through, after all the people that he represented went through, if it's good enough for Nelson Mandela, shouldn't it be good enough for us and the Northern Ireland communities too?
The question is that this House has considered the 7th report of the Defence Committee investigations into fatalities in Northern Ireland involving British military personnel and the government response